Alright, let's start the final installment of the Roaring Twenties. I want to backtrack just a couple slides. I was talking about the Scopes trial earlier and cultural fundamentalism being one of the reactions to the 1920s. And a couple things I wanted to point out. One was that many in the South, especially, did not like these changes, and in rural areas, did not like these changes going on in these urban areas, particularly in the North. And so in many ways, cultural fundamentalism dealt with a fear or a paranoia, but maybe most importantly, a nostalgia for the idealized non-industrial society. They felt like things were moving too quickly and that the world was changing and that they were losing the world as they knew it. But before I leave the Scopes trial, I wanted to pull up a quick website. This is some of the court documents from when Clarence Darrow put William Jennings Bryan on the stand. So this was the big showdown. William Jennings Bryan, being the Christian authority, Clarence Darrow put him on the stand, asked him to be a witness. So this is a little odd that the prosecuting attorney is now on the witness stand. But as you're reading this and I'm talking about it, one of the reasons why cultural fundamentalism it seemed to sort of, at least as far as religion is concerned, die is because of this particular exchange with Darrow's questioning of Bryan. In this especially dramatic session, Darrow put the fundamentalist Bryan on the stand as an expert of the Bible and sharply questioned him on his literal interpretations. Now, he questioned him on many of Bible stories. For example, Jonah and the whale. Did he really think Jonah had been eaten by a whale? So on and so forth. But this is probably the best one, where you get down to the bottom, they're talking about the flood. And he says, when was the flood? I don't know. He says, I never made a calculation. A calculation from what? I could not say. From the generations of man? I would not want to say that, says Bryan. What do you think? Says Darrow. Bryan says, I do not think about things I don't think about. And then Darrow says, well, do you think about things you do think about? And he answered, well, sometimes. And then the courtroom erupted in laughter. The reason why the Scopes trial was seen as such a failure is because of the way that Darrow was able to handle Bryan, even though Bryan technically won the case. And as I mentioned before, this was also the end of cultural fundamentalism because their main leader, William Jennings Bryan, died 5 days after the trial. Okay, let's get back to where we left off. This xenophobia and this fear based on race and ethnicity culminates in the National Origins Act of 1924. As a result of lingering wartime super patriotism and the long-standing ideal of being 100% American, the National Origins Act placed a ceiling of 164,000 on the annual immigration and limited the number of people from any nation to 2% of the total of that national origin living in the U.S. So this is the main reaction you have to the second wave of immigration. This act virtually ended immigration from Eastern Europe because they had already exceeded 2%. Additionally, it completely excluded immigration from Asia, greatly insulting China and Japan, especially after having made the Gentleman's Agreement in 1907 with Japan. In 1929, the quotas were changed to 2% of the census numbers from 1920, so updating, and therefore 2%, the number going up because 2% of the population reflected a larger number by 1920. But this still represented the dominant opinion of rural, native-born Americans against the immigrant-rich urban centers. Again, a part of this backlash. Immigration from Latin America and Canada soared as the act put no restrictions on immigration from the Western Hemisphere. And I say that mostly to point out that the beginning of Hispanic immigration to the United States, as we know it today, which is still a rather contentious issue and is our largest immigrant population, both legal and illegal, begins after this National Origins Act of 1924 and then 29 because it didn't restrict those in the Western Hemisphere. Now, I'm not going to go in and lecture about the Red Scare all over again, but I'll just hit the highlights. This, too, is a reaction to this, all of the things that had been going on: the immigration, the industrialization, the urbanization, um, things that had been done in the name of progress, but this was the reaction to that. So the Red Scare coming out of World War I being that they were afraid that communism was infiltrating the United States. So led by Abe Mitchell Palmer, they conducted a series of Palmer raids. They targeted the Wobblies, International Workers of the World. They arrested Sacco and Vanzetti. And this all ends in about a year, but this is 1919 to 1920, as, again, an example of this xenophobia. And there we have a picture of Sacco and Vanzetti, a popular political cartoon from the day. On the left you see the Salem witch trials in 1692, and then they say Boston labor in 1927. So making the comparison that it's really just a witch hunt. Remember, Sacco and Vanzetti were tried based on mostly circumstantial evidence and fought years of appeals, but were executed in 1927. Okay, and then something that I haven't talked about yet, although it's in your IDs, is the rise of the new Klan. Now, we know that the Klan first emerged during Reconstruction, but in 1915, Colonel William Joseph Simmons revived the organization. The Klan received a charter of incorporation as a nonprofit organization from the Georgia legislature, but still pretty much remained a small organization until 1920. But with 1920 and this decade, as we've seen time and time again, you have a harsh reaction to what some feel as too much change. And they feel like that their American way of life and what it means to be American is increasingly out of their control. In the fall of 1921, some of the members of the Georgia House of Representatives and then later the U.S. House of Representatives began to investigate this new growth as the Klan numbers increasingly went up to just a few hundred to several thousand to tens of thousands. But even though they didn't mean to, what the House was really doing, especially the U.S. Congress, was that they were providing the Klan with free publicity as the media picked up the story. And its membership grew from 100,000 in 1920 to 1 million by 1922. By 1925, due-paying members numbered 2 million, and some estimates are as high as 4 million for this new Klan that comes about in the 1920s. This new Klan promoted 100% Americanism, and it included an emphasis on Protestantism, charity, motherhood, morality, temperance, and education. So, what were they really targeting then? Well, they were targeting anything that didn't fit into those categories. So they began to embrace all hatred, if you want to think about it that way. They had targets other than just African Americans. It included also Roman Catholics, as they believed many of the immigrants who were Catholic were starting to take over, and they saw the Pope as a political autocrat, and they thought they were taking over the United States and the world, and then also Jews. There are a couple of pictures. Here's a picture here on the left, and then an advertisement on the right, also made famous by D.W. Griffiths, The Birth of a Nation. I've talked about that before. It's one of the biggest early movies, which actually showed the racial tension. It was not a movie that denounced the Klan, but rather showed it as this sort of American institution. And then a couple of other propaganda posters, one on the left, America for Americans, and then one of the most famous, this is coming from Wisconsin. See if I can blow it up a little bit here. But it is advertising this party as, this Klan gathering as a party, as a spring festival to be held on Flag Day on June 14th, 1924. And, invite, if you look up the top, invite you, your family, and friends to the first annual Spring Festival and Entertainment. The public is invited. You can find this primary source online. It's really, really fascinating. It says here music, lectures, dancing, refreshments, and admittance to the grounds about and directions to the party. So the Klan really tries to transform itself into this American group that's there to protect American values. This ultimately culminates in the largest event that happens in the Klan's history, and that is they march on Washington in 1926 and have a parade there. You can see them marching there in front of the Capitol, and there's the bigger parade there. So, in their way, they believe that they're protecting something, but what they're really doing is continuing to terrorize African Americans in the South, and also, of course, Catholics and Jews. They're adding pretty much anybody that's not part of that WASP category, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. All right, and then finally, let's look at the beginnings of what leads up to the stock market crash. We had Warren G. Harding, as we know, who becomes president in 1920, campaigning. It's called his front porch campaign. He was sort of a disaster as a public speaker, but he looked like a nice guy, and he was a nice guy, and he promised a return to normalcy, which, as we know now, was a word that he made up, but is now in our vernacular. Herbert Hoover was in his administration, as well as Andrew Mellon. They were called the Ohio Gang, and he died suddenly in 1923. But if he probably would have won the nomination for another presidency. However, his administration was actually riddled with scandal. One of the most famous was the Teapot Dome scandal. But most of the scandals did not emerge until after his death, so he was still seen as a great president at that time. Had he won a second term, lived and won a second term, I don't think it would have ended as well for him, at least as far as his presidential legacy. So when he dies suddenly, Silent Cal, as he's known, Calvin Coolidge, takes his place. Calvin Coolidge was quoted as saying, "The business of America is business." And he was nicknamed Silent Cal more for what he didn't say rather than what he did say. He didn't talk much. He slept a lot. He said there are stories about Calvin Coolidge that he took a nap. He slept late and took a 2-hour nap every single day. He didn't like to entertain the press. He didn't like to do public speaking, but he did encourage business, and overall his term was seen as one that that encouraged or that continued to increase America's prosperity. So he's going to then run again in 1924 and will win as an incumbent, and was mostly won because he was given credit for the booming economy at home, and there was no visible crisis, and there was still a split within the Democratic Party. So he is going to win a second term. That then gets us to the election of 1828 with Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover in the election of 1828 was pitted against Democrat Al Smith. Hoover had been the Secretary of Commerce under Coolidge. Coolidge decided not to run for another term by actually passing a note that said, imagine that, a note, "I do not choose to run for president in 1928. So in part I think he really did it because he had served a term and 3/4 from Harding, so he chose not to run. So Hoover is sort of the natural selection. He's risen within the ranks of the administration, and so he, as you can see there in the chart, wins by a landslide electorally, 444 electoral votes to 87. Al Smith really only carries the Deep South. And Hoover is going to continue this pro-big business stance. There's a real lack of regulations, no real laws that are forcing businesses to make sure that they are practicing good business habits. And with the stock market soaring and not many regulations on it, it is going to lead to the great crash that begins in October of 1929. This is going to end a decade where for really 15, 20 years, by the end of the 20s, the United States had been growing leaps and bounds, but they had been doing so without restraint. And so the stock market crash is going to bring all of this tumbling down and usher in the Great Depression. Thanks.